Noble Lords will notice that I am taking the opportunity provided by this bill to raise again very grave concerns many of us have for those leaseholders and tenants who are, through no fault of theirs, at the heart of the cladding scandal. The fact that up to 1.3 million homes are financially at a very considerable risk of bankruptcy as a direct result of serious construction failings must never be allowed by decision makers to remain unresolved. Leaseholders have done everything right and nothing wrong, yet they are being expected to pay for the failures of construction, of developers, and of materials manufacturers. The government has provided, and I recognise that, over £5 billion towards remediation, but the total cost is anticipated to be over 15 billion, the vast proportion of which is being passed via so-called service charges to leaseholders. We are not talking about charges which are in any way affordable. Pippa in Leeds has, for example, a bill of £140,000. The highest bill I have seen was reported in the latest article on this issue in the Sunday Times. This was a staggering £204,000. Perhaps the Noble Lord the Minister will be able to provide advice as to how these leaseholders are to pay the bills that have landed on their doormat. He will be aware that the leaseholder's major asset is their flat, and that currently has no value. It is not only the costs of remediation that are pressing down on leaseholders, it is also service charges increases, consequent again on the cladding scandal. I have read this from a leaseholder today, and I quote, "I am knee-deep in service charge admin and being harassed with bills that I know are inflated and incorrect and with huge penalties for late payment. No one should have to live like this. The toll it takes on every aspect of your life, and that's before consideration of cladding bills." End of the quote. It is not only leaseholders who fear the worst. The Investors Chronicle has reported in the last 2 weeks that this may become the next PPI scandal. Flat sales are in decline. The affected flats are neither sellable nor mortgageable. Before long, the government will have to take action to save leaseholders from bankruptcy and homelessness, and the housing market in flats from collapse. This amendment is simply to ask the government to take stock within 6 months, and in doing so to be cognizant of the leaseholders whose dreadful plight I have described. The leaseholders have done everything right and nothing wrong, which is a phrase I cannot attribute to developers, constructors, material manufacturers, and indeed government, who, as the final regulator. Between them, they have the responsibility for this absolute scandal.
Now, the Noble Baroness referred to the driver behind this in terms of the tragedy of Grenfell, and I'm bound to say that the process of evaluation and what has come out of that, although in government terms may be seen to be moving with near lightning speed, in terms of leaseholders and those who pay service charges, I'm bound to say this has not been nearly fast enough. And the consequences of that have been amply exposed by the noble Baroness and are ongoing. And this is truly a tragedy for many households who themselves have walked unknowingly into a situation that's been created by the neglect of others. And I'm bound to say the auguries are not particularly good. The proposal, as I interpret it, to leave the power in the hands of leaseholders to claim, admittedly on a longer time frame, but to claim nonetheless against those who didn't observe basic construction standards, does create an almost insuperable hurdle. Now, I think it's appropriate that I pay tribute to those who have, outside the House, promoted the polluter pays bill principle. And I know this has been a matter that's been brought to the attention of the government and would place the basic strict liability on those who failed to make the grade in terms of construction standards.
The government's continued mismanagement of the remediation work continues to be one of the most shameful aspects of this government. I hope the Minister will use this opportunity to finally change track and at last deal with the issues of remediation costs being charged to leaseholders for building safety faults. Rather than another betrayal of their promises to leaseholders, we need legal protections to ensure that millions of pounds of building safety remediation costs are not passed on to innocent homeowners and tenants.
My Lords, this is a devastating case, again, of unfinished business. We've talked several times about unfinished business in respect of reforming the whole leasehold system, and Baroness Pinnock has spoken with great passion about the need to deal with the unfinished business of getting the damaged blocks discovered since the Grenfell fire put back in a safe and workmanlike position. That's a terrible story which is still unravelling and still producing, I think we could say, shock and amazement as the evidence comes out of the inquiry at Grenfell. And as Baroness Pinnock said, it's not an isolated failure. And I ought to have started by reminding the House that I was the Minister with responsibility for building regulations between 2010 and 2012, well before this, but nevertheless relevant. And there was a failure of regulation, there was a failure of every level of the supply chain, there was a failure of the designers, there is a failure of those who were responsible for monitoring progress. And of course the fallout from that is not simply that one building was found to be dangerous, defective, burnt at the cost of 72 lives, but more than 400 other buildings have been found to be equally or worse defective. And of course, as is so often the case, once you begin to look, you see plenty else. There's an estimate from the British Woodworking Association of 600,000 defective fire doors which are installed in buildings in this country. So in that context, it's good to know that the government has come forward with a compensation scheme allocating £5 billion. Perhaps the Minister can tell us whether the guidelines for applying for that compensation have yet been published. My last understanding is that they haven't, but maybe he can bring some information to your Lordship's House today. And in that context, it has to be right that this House considers the situation facing those leaseholders and, insofar as we can, safeguard their position. Now, this is actually a very modest amendment. It only calls for a review within 6 months, not for the spending of government money, nothing for ministers to shy away from, but simply to make sure that the relevance of this legislation to the ongoing tragedy of Grenfell and the ongoing battle that hundreds of thousands of leaseholders are facing with enormous bills. Baroness Pinnock has eloquently spelt that out. That isn't something which can simply be passed by your Lordship's House without giving the most serious consideration to it. And I know the Minister has repeatedly found himself at the dispatch box having to say essentially the same thing. This is not the time, this is not the place, this is not the right legislation. And we have to reply to him, well, when is the time? Where is the place? Where is the legislation? And we need to see some answers. And certainly this is a matter that we do wish to press in the oncoming vote.
Now, the noble Baroness Lady Pinnock again raised the issue of historic fire and building safety remediation costs. And I was struck by the very high bill that was quoted of around £204,000 per leaseholder. And my understanding is this bill is this may be a building in Manchester, but I would be very keen to know further details and to understand the approach that has been taken. Because very often when I've inquired and understood the situation, it's not necessarily been the most proportionate response that has been considered by the building owner, but I'd be very interested to look into that case in more detail. I can also say, in response to the noble Lord Stunell, that we are very aware of the polluter pays bill and the work that's been done, being led by Steve Day of RAC, and this is something that we're looking at very carefully to see if it could also further enhance the proposed building safety bill. Of course, we've looked at already at strengthening redress by extending the statutory limitation period in the Defective Premises Act 1972 from 6 years to 15 years applied retrospectively, but this could provide further support to ensure that it is the polluter that pays, and we're looking at that, as I said, very, very carefully. Also in response to the noble Lord Stunell about the building safety bill, of course, the first £1 billion of this has been in play and spent. And in fact, the fund is very much overcommitted, and the further 3.5 billion, further details around that will be published in September. But works are not being delayed because of that, and I'm happy to provide that assurance that the further expenditure will be outlined therefore at that stage.